Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar and taking some time out of your busy day. We're really excited about today's topic, which is going to be focused on some of the big trends we're seeing today in healthcare, specifically in the patient registration and patient access areas. We're very pleased to have a guest speaker with us today. My name is Brad Josephson. I'm the Director of Marketing here at PMMC, and we actually have one of our technology partners today that will be sharing some of the more high-level industry trends that we're seeing today in healthcare. Eric has some unique experience in that he brings experience outside of healthcare from other industries, so he's going to be talking a lot about some of the developments in other industries that are beginning to show up in healthcare in the patient registration space. So with that, well, before we let Eric get started, I did want to let you know that we will be taking questions. You should see a questions tab in your GoToWebinar panel. If you do have any questions, please go ahead and type those in, and I will be watching them throughout the presentation. And we'll let Eric take those at the very end. So with that, I'd like to introduce Eric Anderson.
Thank you, Brad. I am Eric Anderson, and I am the COO at Clearwave Corporation. I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy day today to participate in this webinar. I hope that you find this informative and helpful as you're evaluating the potential use of self-service in your hospitals. Of course, today I won't be talking anything about Clearwave. Our goal is really to discuss trends in self-service, in particular as it relates to patient registration, but also how it's used in other industries and how to successfully implement it. The reality is that we live in a self-service economy. We use self-service every day, most of us, sometimes multiple times a day. But it's really just beginning in healthcare. And I think one statistic that really highlights this fact is if you look at all of the self-service kiosks deployed throughout the United States, 88% of those self-service kiosks are deployed in two industries. And I bet you could guess which two. And I'll give you a hint. One of them is not healthcare, right? So the two industries are retail. You've got 47% of self-service kiosks deployed in retail industries, and that includes, of course, things like grocery stores. 41% are deployed in hospitality, which, of course, includes airlines, travel, restaurants. So I don't think it's any real surprise that hospitality and retail are leading the pack in deployment of self-service because their focus is on the customer experience. And so the remaining 12% of those self-service kiosks are deployed in all other industries, including, of course, healthcare. So before we get into more details on that, I would like to just introduce myself and give you a little bit of a feel for my background and perspective. Like most people, when I went off to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but growing up on a farm, I knew I wanted an office job. So I went off to Shepherd University and got an undergraduate degree in accounting and really thought that my career would be spent in finance. I later went to Virginia Tech and received an MBA with a concentration in finance. But when I went to work for Ernst & Young as a management consultant, I got the opportunity to work on technology projects. And I just fell in love with it. And frankly, I never looked back. And later in my career, I was leading an e-business strategy for a Fortune 500 company and had an opportunity to go off to Stanford University as a part of an executive program to sort of deepen my knowledge and gain the Silicon Valley perspective, if you will. So basically, since 1999, I've been working in internet and e-business across different companies and industries. And while there's been a lot of variability in the types of applications I've been involved with, they've all been focused on using the internet, cloud-based applications to make life easier on companies and their customers. And that's really been my focus. And speaking of making life easier, let's talk a little bit about registration. You know, It is a difficult and challenging task, registering patients. There is a tremendous amount of effort that goes into it, and I have a great deal of respect for registration agents and front desk staff. It is a very difficult job. There's a tremendous amount of variability. There's a lot of information that has to be gathered, and any given patient is going to come in with a different set of data that's required, right? It's not like every patient walking in is going to have the same set of information completed. There's going to be differing amounts of consents and insurance information that has to be dealt with. And so in the midst of all of this complexity, you end up with, of course, bottlenecks. You end up with lines, frustrated patients, and there's really no time to engage patients on matters related to their health and wellness. And the patients, frankly, they're passive participants in this process. They don't take an active role. They don't have any sense of ownership. They're more or less responding to requests from the registration staff for information. And as an end result of that, on the back end, we run into problems. And in fact, 80% of billing office staff time is dedicated to rework that's somehow related to a registration error. And so what we're going to be talking about here is how we can change these realities by adopting self-service tools that are very commonly used in other industries. Now, I'd like to step back from all of this for a second. I've already confessed that I used to work at a Big Six as a management consultant, so I'm a little partial to management consulting studies, and this one is from Deloitte from 2013. And this is not a healthcare specific analysis. This is really just self-service in general. And what is it and what does it mean? And so if you look at this chart, they're trying to encapsulate everything on one page, which is always a little challenging. But if you look at the top there where it talks about channels, all they're saying here is these are the different ways in which a patient can engage in self-service. They can access self-service via the web. They can do it via a mobile device. They could do it at a kiosk, or of course there's the telephone. The second section here that talks about client functions, this is really what is it that the patient is trying to do. So they're accessing self-service via some channel, whether it's the web or their mobile phone, but what are they trying to do? Are they trying to maybe find out their lab results? Perhaps they want to update their demographic data and change their cell phone number. Or maybe they want to find out if this particular hospital accepts their insurance. Or they might want to determine what is their estimated out-of-pocket for a given procedure. So those are what Deloitte is calling client functions, right? It's what is the patient trying to do. And then the management functions, of course, are our internal processes. So anytime you engage in self-service, you're basically exposing something to the patients. You're allowing them to engage in viewing information or conducting a transaction, and that, of course, has to be backed up with processes and procedures internally that enable that to happen successfully. And the last piece, of course, is the gadget. What is the technology? What is the infrastructure that is enabling that self-service? And so I think, in my experience, when we think about self-service, it's pretty easy for us to get our heads wrapped around what do we want the patient to do, right? What is our goal here? If we successfully install self-service, what would we like the patient to be doing? And we can probably also envision how we expect them to do that, whether it be logging into a website or using their mobile phone. And of course, everybody likes to look at technology, or at least I do. And so, you can look at all the different vendors out there and the different tools that are available. But it's important that as we're considering all of these pieces, that we really think a good deal about, if I do this, how does that impact my internal management functions? What changes might I need to make to my processes in order to make this successful? And we will talk more about key success factors when you decide to adopt self-service, regardless of what the particular function is you're trying to enable. It's important to evaluate your processes, and we'll talk about key success factors in a few moments. One of the interesting things to me about self-service is that in healthcare is it's really just beginning. Having said that, there is a growing realization that it's time that we embrace self-service. And here's some quotes from Dr. Krauss, who's the Senior Director of Worldwide Health at Microsoft. And he is an evangelist, if you will, for self-service and patient convenience. But if you look at bullet number 2 there, imagine if you had a patient say to you, I wish it was as easy to book an airline ticket as it was to make an appointment at my hospital. I wish it was as easy to find a price for a product on Amazon as it was for me to find out how much it's going to cost me to have hip replacement surgery, right? And what's interesting about that is all the tools that those retail industries and the transportation and hospitality industry, all the tools they're using to enable those wonderful experiences are available and are starting to be used in healthcare. And the reality is, whether or not any one of us decides to go down this path and embrace self-service, the technology is being adopted, and as we'll show in a few minutes here, is likely to be adopted quickly. Now, I just love this slide, and I would bet that some of you have seen this before. It's been around for about 10 years, but it's just such a wonderful chart. It, of course, is mapping out the adoption rate in the U.S. of certain types of technologies. And what's so fascinating about it to me is how the adoption rate has changed dramatically over time. If you look at the telephone, it took 75 years for the telephone to be in 90% of U.S. households. If you look at the cell phone, it took 15 years. So, and that is really the theme of this chart. As you get up into the 60s and the 70s and the 90s and the 2000s, you see a lot of very vertical lines because the adoption rate of technology is getting much faster as time has gone on. Now, if you roll that back and you say, okay, great, I see the adoption for cell phones and so forth, but what does this mean in the self-service world? Now, some of you in the Northeast may be familiar with Price Chopper. Price Chopper is a grocery store. They have about 200 locations in Massachusetts, New York, Vermont. They were the first place that installed a self-checkout kiosk. And so there was an inventor, and he had this prototype, and the folks at Price Chopper said, hey, let's try that in 1992. 16 years later, there were 92,000 units installed. And only a short 6 years after that, you had over 400,000 units. So from one lonely little unit in Clifton Park, New York, to over 400,000 units today. And if you look at pay at the pump, I will date myself. So 1986 was the year I got my driver's license. And it was also the year that pay at the pump was first introduced in the U.S. And a short 8 years later, 13% of gas stations had it. 8 years after that, 80% of gas stations had it. And the reality is, unless you're in New Jersey or Oregon, which have some interesting laws about how gas is pumped, if you tried to open a gas station today without pay at the pump, you would go out of business. It is expected as a convenience to people when they're fueling their cars. Now, when you look at self-service patient registration, you know, I tried to find the statistic on when that was first installed, and I couldn't, so I took a statistic that I know. And I know when we installed our first one, and that was 2006. And as we go forward 8 years to 2014, about 10% of healthcare facilities have some form of self-service check-in. Now, I don't know how many are going to have it in 2022. And I'll be honest with you, as I sit here today, 2022 sounds like a long way away. But, you know, in 1986, 1994 sounded like a long way away. So the reality is it will be here before we know it. And while none of us can say what percentage the adoption rate will be in healthcare, we can look at what's happened in other industries, and we can forecast that the adoption rate will be dramatic. and it will likely be much more than we would ever have imagined sitting here in the early part of 2015. Now, I did pull 2 articles because self-service, this one's from MGMA, and then a later one is from HFMA. This is starting to get a lot more press in the healthcare space. This article in the magazine actually is from June of 2014. So about 8 months ago, MGMA published an issue, and the entire issue was dedicated to how can we use information management techniques to improve the patient experience. And inside that issue is an article that's all about registration, self-service registration. It talks about the many benefits associated with it. And what's interesting is that a lot of what they talk about in that article, or maybe it's not surprising, I mean, this is the MGMA, after all. A lot of what they talk about is revenue cycle benefits. And really, registration is the start of the revenue cycle. And if we get good information at the point of registration, if we verify it, if we validate it, then we're going to have a lot fewer problems on the back end. And so in this way, by using self-service registration, we're going to get clean information into our systems, and it's also, of course, going to improve the experience for the patient. Now, I promise this is the last slide that I will do from a consulting company. This one's from PricewaterhouseCoopers. They have a health industries practice. And what they were trying to evaluate is, in particular in healthcare, in hospitals and clinics, what happens when you install a kiosk? What difference does it make when we put a kiosk in a hospital or a clinic? And you can see for yourself they found a great reduction in the time spent in the waiting room. And they also found a tremendous reduction in demographic errors. And you may look at that and say, well, 90%, is it really possible that you can have that dramatic a reduction in demographic errors? And I would tell you, living this every day, that's absolutely true. And I'd like to illustrate it with a story. There's a large nationally known healthcare organization, has a lot of facilities and locations across the country, and they had a board member on their board of directors, checks into a facility and says, I have new insurance, here's my new insurance card, and they say, no problem, we've got this. He has his service, goes home, and the bill is sent to the old insurance company. He gets an invoice that's incorrect, it's on the wrong insurance. So he goes back a second time to the same facility. He says, look, last time I was here, I told you I have new insurance. Here's my new insurance card. Please, can we get it right this time? And of course, you can see where this is going. They did not get it right the second time. So he goes off to the board meeting, tells this story, the CEO gets involved, and they put that facility on red alert. They are on the lookout for this guy. When he comes in, they are going to get it right this time. Well, it turns out he went to a different facility the third time, and the same scenario played out a third time. So obviously at this point it's gotten to be quite an embarrassment, and in fact it has some executives wondering if this is happening to board members, what's happening to patients every day. And of course the reason I know this story is we're talking to them about how they can fix this problem. And you know, I could give you many more examples. There's another local multi-site location that had a patient go to collections. And when the collection agency finally caught up with this patient, he was quite upset and came in to talk to the administrator there. And when they looked in his record, in fact, the patient had submitted a change of address, had filled out the piece of paper, handed it to the registration agent, and it never made it into the system. So when you have a paper-based process, when you do not give your patients the ability to update this information for themselves, there are tremendous opportunities for errors. And if you are able to give the patient ownership of it, if you're able to automate the process by which you collect it and have it update your systems in real time, you will see dramatic reductions in errors and things will run much more smoothly. Now I do want to, and I I try never to do this, but I'm going to do it today, so forgive me. I'm going to read bullet number 2, because when I first saw that, I had to read it about 4 times to let it sink in. This is one of the findings from the study. Self-service kiosks have proven impactful to the patient's decision to return to a facility and to recommend friends and family to a facility. So, in other words, the patient didn't go to the hospital because they had a kiosk, right? The patient didn't say, oh, gee, I got to go down to Northside Hospital because they've got a self-service registration. That's not how it works. How it works is they walk into your hospital. They then realize you have self-service. It's convenient. It's easy to use. They're spending less time waiting. The information gets processed successfully and correctly. It makes for a better experience, and they remember that. And as a result of remembering that, they are more likely to come back to your hospital. And they are more likely to tell their friends and family, hey, that's a really convenient place to go. It's a lot easier and a lot more hassle-free than other experiences I've had at hospitals. And so that's really the patient experience side of this. And you can see so far we've been talking a lot about patient experience. We've been talking a lot about benefits on the back end from a revenue cycle management perspective. But there is another piece to this puzzle, and it really concerns patient engagement. So when you have a patient that is checking in at some self-service mechanism that they're using to check in to your facility, you've got their undivided attention, and there's an opportunity there to reach out to them about matters that are important to their health and wellness. And I've got 2 examples. This one is from an ophthalmology clinic, and the second one is from a hospital. So I don't know if you know this, but laser vision correction is an extremely competitive industry, very competitive. And this chart comes from a fairly large ophthalmology practice, and they do annual eye exams. They're full service, right? They'll sell you glasses, but they also do laser vision correction. So they spend about $20,000 a month on radio and print advertisements, and you may have heard ads on the radio or seen them in a magazine for laser vision correction. Well, what happened in August is they were already using self-service registration, and they thought, well, wonder if we were to ask certain patients, not all patients, right? We'll just ask patients of a certain age coming in for a certain type of exam. Like I myself wear glasses, and I go in every year for an eye exam and to make sure my prescription doesn't need to be changed. So someone like me would be a perfect candidate for them. So I would walk in, they know why I'm coming in, they know how old I am, and they say, hey, Eric, did you know that laser vision correction can often provide better vision than glasses or contacts? Are you interested in learning more about this? It takes a few seconds for me to answer. Well, you can see what a dramatic impact this had. They went from an average of 100 patients a month to 3, 4, almost 500 in some months raising their hand and saying, I'm interested in this. And here's the great news. These aren't people on the street that heard the radio advertisement. These are existing patients that are inside your facility. And in fact, when they say, yes, I'm interested at the kiosk, the doctor gets a text message. And so when he or she walks into the clinical room and to see the patient, he or she knows Eric's interested in laser vision correction because, of course, being interested doesn't mean you're a candidate, right? So they have to do a preliminary evaluation to determine if you're even a candidate. But they can actually do that while I'm there, making it very convenient for me. And if I am a candidate, then they can schedule a new appointment with a surgeon to come back and take the next step to having laser vision surgery done. So you can see what a dramatic impact this has had, and their surgery volume has more than doubled since they started doing this. And it just takes a few seconds. There was no additional cost to doing this. It was just part of registration. Now for an example from a hospital customer. They came up with a new lung cancer CT screening process, and at most, it would cost you $99, at most. And depending on what insurance you have, it might even be free. And so they spent a lot of time thinking about what's the best way to raise patient awareness. So they put together, and it was very well done. And I mean that sincerely. It was probably one of the best brochures I've ever looked at. It was trifold. It was just really well done, informative. The problem was nobody looked at the brochure. And, you know, I'm sure if you were to walk out in the waiting room area of your hospital, you're going to see everybody's glued to their cell phone, right? People are not looking at brochures. They're not picking them up. So what they decided to do, and they have self-service registration throughout their facility. They've got multiple hospitals. They've got breast health centers, cancer centers, imaging centers, physician-owned practices, you name it, right? So they decided what we're going to do is when patients of a certain age, and I think in this case it was between 55 and 70 was the age range, but that were also smokers. So when a smoker checks in who's between 55 and 70, we're going to ask them if they're interested in learning more about our quick and easy lung cancer screening. And what they found is 28%, and to be honest, I was quite surprised. I thought it would be lower. They're getting over 1 out of 4 smokers to say yes. And then what happens is the next day, they have a staff member from the imaging center that picks up the phone and says, hey, Mrs. Jones, I see you checked in yesterday at our breast health facility, and you said you were interested in a lung cancer screen. I'm calling you to answer your questions and schedule your appointment. So this is a really wonderful way, because of course with cancer, early detection is key to maximizing positive outcomes. So this is a great way that you can raise patient awareness about a screening that is really life-saving. So this is just another one of those benefits where today, in today's world, you don't have time to ask every patient that comes in if they want a lung cancer screen. And even if you did have the time, how do you know if they're a candidate? You know, are you going to guess at their age? Whereas if you use self-service registration, you can program in these things and say, hey, if the patient checking in is 55, between 55 and 70, and if they're a smoker, let's ask the question. Now, I'm going to change gears on you and talk a little bit about how to do this successfully. Hopefully, up to now, I've given you some ideas on why this is being adopted in healthcare and what the benefits are. But the reality is, to do it successfully, there's a few key ingredients. And from my view, there's really 3 things. It really does come down to people, process, and technology in that order. You have to get your staff involved and engaged. You have to have a good process design. And of course, you have to have the right technology that's going to be usable by your people and work within your process. So let's go through each one of these here. You know, we don't like change. I don't like change. People in general don't like change. You know, Mr. Kettering said it best when he said the world hates change, yet it is the only thing that has brought progress. And that is absolutely true. You know, if I think back to pay at the pump, I do remember when that came out, and I'll be honest with you, my initial reaction, it seems foolish to say this today, but my initial reaction was, why should I do that? I saw the little gadget, and my thought was, that's the gas station attendant's job. That's not my job. But then one day, it was raining, and I didn't want to get wet, so I had an incentive. I figured it out, and I've never looked back since. Now, we can accept it as a fact that people don't like change, but if you don't tell them that you're changing and you don't explain why they're changing, they're really going to get obstinate, right? So in order, we need to work and we need to communicate with our patients. We need to get our staff involved and help them understand what we're doing, why we're doing it. And if you do this, this is going to lay the groundwork for success. You know, I tell folks all the time, if your staff want this initiative to fail, they will succeed, guaranteed. If your staff doesn't want this to work, it won't. So we really need to get the staff folks involved, make sure that they help design it. Let them have input. They know the situation on the ground best, frankly. We want their input, and we want to get them excited and involved in the process, and that is critical. And once you get the staff involved, you want to communicate to your patients, but I'll tell you, in my opinion, if your staff support this, they will bring the patients right along with them. If the patients see that the staff are excited and the staff help them understand why we're doing this, patients will be fine. but it is important. And if you overlook this, frankly, you're setting yourself up for some real challenges. Now, the second piece, of course, is process. And, you know, let me say this. Let's say you have done a wonderful job. You have got your patients and staff so excited about this, they can't stand it. They are counting the days until this thing gets installed. That's wonderful. But if the first time a patient uses it, it's complicated, it's difficult, they'll never use it again. And so it is important to communicate and get people on board, but as important, it has to be easy to use. If you go with self-service, and that's regardless, whether it's self-service registration or patient portal or anything like that, it has to be really simple. And if it's simple and easy to use, people will come back and they'll use it again and again. So as we design this, and you know, Albert Einstein, things should be made as simple as possible, but not any simpler. And let me give you an example. It would be simple, it would be the height of simplicity if we said, you know what, let's not worry about consents. Who cares about those meaningful use questions? And why do we want to bother with payment? That would make life pretty simple, right? Just patient walks in, I'm here, okay, walk on back. Of course, we can't do that. So there are certain things that we have to do. So we're going to make it as simple as we can, but we're still going to make sure that we're complying with regulations. We're still going to make sure that we're getting the necessary consents, that we're collecting payment, but inside those bounds, right? So there's a fence, and we've got to do the things that are inside that fence. We want to make this as easy as possible. And if you do that, patients will absolutely flock to it. Now, the last piece, of course, is technology. And, you know, I love this Pablo Picasso quote, computers are useless, they can only give you answers. And that is absolute truth, right? Computers have no brain, we have to use our own. And so when you're looking at technology, you need to be very skeptical, right? You need to ask some hard questions. And let's make sure that, in fact, this piece of technology is going to integrate seamlessly with your other systems. You need to make sure that it is customizable to your particular facility and your particular needs. Let's be honest, if you do self-service registration, for example, the information that you need to collect from someone at a breast health center is different from a cancer center, is different from the emergency department where you've got EMTALA guidelines. So it has to be customizable, and it has to fit within your facility, within your processes. Now, I will say this. If you are able to tie these three things together, if you are able to get your staff on board with the change, if you communicate with your patients, if it's easy to use and the process has been changed and is well understood, and you get the right technology, I guarantee you, you will be successful. There's no question about it. But, you know, please just be careful when you go through, and let's make sure that we get our staff involved and we have a good process design and good technology, and then it holds together. So I'll go now to my HFMA article. And actually, I've got a couple of statistics here from Baptist Health. So this was an article that was, I think it was January of this year in HFMA about how you can use self-service registration and bill estimation, to improve the patient experience. And I think you'll see that the 2 bullet points there. You know, we're really talking about an opportunity to engage our patients and make life more convenient for them. And that's what we're trying to do. And Baptist Health has really done a phenomenal job. It's amazing for me to have witnessed what they've achieved. And just to give you a sense, these utilization statistics, they are from the full year 2014. So this isn't, you know, a cherry-picked week or month. This is the full, all of last year. And what this utilization is telling you is how many times when a patient walks into any facility, and you can see it's segregated here by hospitals, which includes emergency department, you've got your imaging centers, cancer centers, physician-owned practices, and so forth. How often when a patient walks into that facility do they use the kiosk to check in? And so across all facilities, 94% of patients, so every 94 out of 100 people walking in the door, go straight up to the kiosk and use self-service. Believe me, patients would not do that if it wasn't easy. They absolutely would not. And I also want to make a point to counterbalance this. You will never get 100% utilization, nor do you want it, frankly. You will have some patients that absolutely will not use this, do not want to use it, and to that I say that's fine. We're not trying to make this mandatory any more than the gas station mandates that you must pay at the pump, right? You can go inside. It's okay. You can wait in line. So if people want to go to the front desk and they want to talk and have a conversation, that's fantastic. The great news for the other 9 or 10 people or 9 people, they don't have to wait in line. So they can go ahead and check themselves in and take the express lane, if you will, to registration. So if you're sitting there wondering, you know, would my patients actually use this? They will, with the qualifier that you've got to tell them why you're doing it. You've got to have a good design, a well-designed process that accommodates it, and it's got to be easy. And if you do those things, I guarantee you, your patients will absolutely take to this. And of course, that's across demographic profiles. You know, if you look at these facilities, you've got some that trend towards older patients. And they've still got very high utilization. Now, the last point that I'd like to make, of course, is that this doesn't happen overnight. Depending upon the size of your facility, this can take quite a bit of time. Or, you know, if you have a smaller facility, it could be quite easy. In the case of Baptist, it was a journey that started in 2012 and more or less finished in 2014. You can see they had about 100,000 patients checking in at kiosk in 2012. They doubled that in 2013 and just about doubled it again in 2014. So it was a phased rollout, facility specific, and you know, I would never recommend that you go from not using self-service anywhere to using it everywhere. There's always needs to be some thought given to the appropriate way to roll this out. How do you determine which facilities should be first? But once you get a 1 or 2 under your belt, you'll be pretty surprised at how easy the rollout is. You know, the first one is always the most difficult, no question about it, because you're answering a lot of questions around process. And sometimes it can be difficult within a facility type. So if you have 4 breast health centers, well, when you do the first one, the other 3 will be easy because you more or less know what you need to do at the kiosk at a breast health center. Might be slightly different at the cancer center. Will definitely be different in the emergency department, right? So these things do take time, but it is absolutely achievable, and the technologies are certainly available today. Now, if I have done a good job, and I hope I have, and I hope it's been informative, if I've done my job, then every bullet on this slide we have talked about. And my goal, frankly, was to get through this in less than 45 minutes out of respect for your time, but also to give us an opportunity if there have been any questions during the presentation. And I know I went through this pretty quickly, and no doubt any one of these slides I could have talked about at length. But my goal was to give you a quick overview. Certainly, if you would like to chat with me, I love talking about this. I have a real passion for it, and I'd be happy to speak to anyone at length, frankly, about this topic. But with that, Brad, I'd like to ask you if we've had any questions while I was doing the presentation.
Well, thanks so much, Eric. You've put a lot of great thoughts and ideas out there. And if the audience does have any questions, we still have about 10 to 15 minutes left. If you could enter any questions you have within the question tab in your window pane, it's just a simple chat feature. I'd be happy to pass those along to Eric. And Eric, we'll start out with one here. How does this whole self-service registration work within an environment that already has a patient portal in place?
Okay, great. Thank you, Brad. And actually, that is a question that comes up frequently. And to answer it, I'll reach back to one of the early slides from Deloitte that had those self-service channels. And so the patient portal is a web channel, right? So that is an opportunity for patients to access the portal via the web, and they're able to update information. So my view on patient portals is they're extremely useful. and provide a great mechanism to communicate securely with patients before and after the visit to the hospital. And depending upon the patient portal that you have, you might be able to communicate medical information, who knows, renew prescriptions, schedule appointments. And so that is one self-service offering, right, where the patient is using the web to access the patient portal. And it is, in fact, complementary with the other channels. So if you have used a patient portal, let's take this scenario. You are the model patient. You have logged into the patient portal. You have provided every piece of information that the hospital has asked you to provide. You may have even remitted a payment. When you walk into the facility, that second channel, the kiosk, provides that continued paperless self-service registration that you experienced and the convenience you experienced when you were at home. So we view that as a complementary offering to self-service registration. And frankly, it's just another channel for self-service in healthcare.
Great. We've got a couple others here. The first one, will we get a copy of the presentation after this webinar is complete? And yes, you will receive a copy. And Eric, the other question we had come in, do you know the name of the facility that was in the first slide that had the pictures of their check-in area? Is that one of your facilities?
I do. That is an ophthalmology group here in Atlanta. It's the Thomas Eye Group.
Great.
In fact, that's my eye doctor, and from my office I can almost see the building. It's about a mile away. So they're a well-known provider here locally in Atlanta. They have 9 locations, and that picture is from their flagship location.
And I bet you use their kiosk to check in, don't you?
I do, and the last time I did it, it took me 37 seconds. So
that's great. Next question. Is there a way to tie self-service registration with giving patients an estimate like Baptist is doing? And what's your advice to those hospitals that are looking to tie those together?
So that's an interesting question because, you know, and this gets back to choosing technology that works with your other systems, right? Self-service does not happen in a vacuum, and it needs to complement everything else you're doing as a facility. And so for those hospitals that are doing estimation, and of course this is not my expertise, I'll answer the question with the confession that I'm not an expert at all in estimation, but my understanding is the goal here is to create an estimate so that a patient will know how much they have to pay. And facilities vary, of course, as to when they must collect that, right? Meaning, do they require the patient to pay it well in advance of their date of service or whatever? But be that as it may, here's the point. When you walk up to register at that kiosk, it needs to bat cleanup in this sense. So if there's an estimate out there and I'm checking in and I have not paid it, I should be asked to pay it at the kiosk. And so that estimate needs to be brought forward. And in addition, the kiosk ought to be verifying my benefits. And in a real dynamic scenario, that updated benefit information with my remaining deductible and so forth ought to be used as inputs to the estimate. And that calculation could be done in real time to bring back an actual updated estimate, if you will, of patient responsibility. And that's what is really, to me, so fascinating about the technologies that are available to us today is we can do all this. We can do in real time. We can update estimates, and we can present that information to patients for collection at the kiosk. So I don't know if I answered the question, Brad, but I guess my overall thought is it needs to be integrated. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. Another question we just had come in. Can your eligibility platform provide information and the ability to collect multiple copays?
Okay. That is a great question. So here's what we see when it comes, and you notice I'm not going to say yes or no, because that is a good question, and if I were to give you a simple answer, I'd be lying. So we do, and all self-service platforms work a little differently. So I can't speak for others, but I'll speak for ourselves. The way we do it is we parse out copays. And so when I hear you say, can we collect multiple copays, now we're getting into talking about perhaps facility copays, or I could be checking into an imaging center and my MRI copay is a very specific thing. So if I'm checking in for an MRI, there's a very specific copay attached to that. So the way that we do that is we know the reason the patient is checking in. So if my appointment type is MRI, we will go out and actually pull the MRI copay when the patient checks in. So I may not be answering your question exactly right, because I could interpret that more than one way. But if your question is, do we recognize that copays vary by service type, by facility type, and do we bring back, based upon rules, parse out the copay that's specific to the facility and specific to the appointment? If that's the question, the answer is yes.
Okay. What about the hospital versus lab versus physician?
Yes, we do that, and that again, I may not be using the right terminology, but I kind of use the word facility type, right? So if I'm checking into a primary care doctor versus an urgent care, an imaging center, there are different copays, and we do parse those out. Now, I'll also tell you, and I know we've got a sophisticated audience here, there's a lot of different insurance plans out there, and no rule you could put in place under the sun is going to be right 100% of the time. So all of this is there's no absolutes in this business, but we do have the logic, and we do that parsing out of copays.
Great. And for the audience, do we have any other final questions before we sign off here and let Eric go? Well, I'll ask you one, Eric. You touched on this a little bit about, communicating and educating the staff and patients. What about initially getting over that hump? I mean, will patients actually use this if they see a kiosk, in the hospital, or are they going to be, kind of stuck in the traditional method of checking in and filling out paperwork?
So the key to getting patients to use it is placement, obviously letting them know what it is and why it's there. But we're also trying to address this through signage. So our latest model, we've got a big check mark on it with the word "in" under it. So when patients walk in, and if they see that LED sign that says check-in, they'll go right to it. But the key, the initial thing, is having someone welcome them and say, we have now implemented self-service registration. Here's the self-service registration station. Would you like to use it? So have someone out from behind the front desk to greet the patient, show them where the kiosk is, to stand there. You can kind of view it as a concierge, in essence. And if you do that for a couple of days, patients will get the idea. And when one patient sees another patient at it, they'll get the idea. And it's not going to be overnight, but within 30 to 60 days, it will be like it's been there the whole time. And so, and I'll just tell you one quick funny story. Whenever you do this, as I mentioned, there will always be some people who do not want to use it, who will complain, and it's just the reality. We don't like change, and some people don't want to use it. The only installs we've ever done where no one complained were in Manhattan. For some reason, they loved it. You mean I don't have to go talk to anybody? They checked in at the kiosk, they took to it, and there wasn't a single complaint. And you didn't even have to tell them to do it. They saw it and went right to it. So it does vary somewhat by area, but I think you'll see in most areas, the first day you install it, you'll get anywhere from 70% or 80% of patients to use it, and then over time you'll see that trend up as people get used to it.
Great. And at this time, I think we'll take one final call for any questions that you have for Eric. All right. Well, I think that'll wrap things up for us. Actually, I take that back. We have one more question. What about different languages on the kiosk? Is that a capability that you have?
It is, and what is so interesting about that? I was talking to a customer, and I'm going to struggle to remember where they were. I can't remember, but I asked them about languages, and they actually have. I think it was MOAC. I'd never even heard of it. I apologize if that just makes me ignorant, but depending upon, there are certain areas where they'll have languages that you would never imagine that they need. So here's how we approach languages. English and Spanish, we do those standard unless you tell us you don't need Spanish. We have done Latin-based, non-Latin-based. We've done Arabic, Mandarin, Portuguese, you name it, Russian. So here's how we do it. We prefer if the provider does the translation, right? This is a medical registration device. We would rather your folks, we can hire an interpreter, but the way we do it, Brad, to answer your question is we don't charge anything to set up additional languages, but we do ask if it's beyond English and Spanish that the hospital do the translation, use someone they trust, and then we'll input that language. Now, if for whatever reason they need us to contract with a party to do that, we'll do that. But we do support multiple languages, and it's sometimes surprising the languages that are needed. But the answer is yes.
Okay. That was a great question from the audience.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're coming up on just about an hour here. So, Eric, I'd like to thank you again so much for taking the time here to talk about patient registration, some of the trends you're seeing. And thank you so much to the audience. We know you're all very busy, so thanks for taking an hour out of your busy afternoons. And we'll let you get back to what you do best. We will be sending out a copy of the slides and recording within the next couple of days. And if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact either myself or Eric. Eric, thanks again.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye now.